The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the second day of this November sesshin in 2020 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'd like to continue a little bit with the theme from yesterday about the long maturation, which is absolutely vital in our Zen practice. And it's not something that was considered in at least not overtly, in the Japanese Zen that we inherited. In fact, quite the opposite in a certain way, despite the fact that Torei Enji, who was Hakuin's first and most foremost Dharma successor, was a proponent of it, that just to do meditation isn't sufficient. Just to have even enlightenment isn't sufficient. That unless it is reflected in our daily life, in everything we do or say or think, it's basically, one might say, even worse than worthless, because it can make us think we're more important than we are. It can make us think we are more free than we are. Human beings are psychological creatures, and human beings have issues. We grow up in different kinds of environments, some of them not so happy, and some of them downright traumatic, in fact. We experience loss, we experience pain and suffering, sometimes at the hands of our caregivers, sometimes simply the circumstances of our lives. And they all impact us. And it is known that many people take up meditation really as an escape. And it's important for us to recognize that meditation is not meant to be an escape. It's meant to be a source of the freedom to live with whatever is going on, regardless of how it is. If it is something that can be changed effectively, then to move towards changing it. If it's not something that can be changed, then to work with coming to terms with that. It is quite possible that the reason there have been abuses in Buddhist recent Western history is because people ignored that and simply overrode what was going on. We are taught initially in Japanese Zen to cut. And that meant basically to cut our thoughts in the interest of focusing completely on the koan, the process of coming to awakening. And it can work to bring us a kensho, but it also, in that same way, works to create a situation for us where we learn to use the meditation to suppress uncomfortable feelings, deny inappropriate behavior, and so on and so forth. And this is not what Buddhism is about. Sure, we can say, well, the Buddha left his family, but he left his family in a very, very different time period. And he left them in circumstances where they were certainly going to be taken care of. We don't know what the culture was at the time. It's way too long ago to know. And in fact, we don't even know really that the Buddha was Indian or Nepali. There's a strong possibility that he was actually Greek. The Greeks had overrun India and that part of the world in that era. But be that as it may, it's not really relevant to us. What is relevant is modern Western society and how different it is from Eastern societies. And Zen practice came to the West mostly through Japan, some through Korea, some through China, but most of what is in America these days is of Japanese source. And the Japanese culture is very, very, very different from the Western culture. And that needs to be recognized and worked with. As I said in the beginning, we grow in ways in the West where we encounter a particular perspective on the kinds of things that happen to us. And that is often reinforced in the interest of, for example, abusers in a denial of what goes on. Yet, as we do our Zen practice, these kinds of things, the results of these kinds of behaviors and experiences begins to come to consciousness. And it can come to consciousness in different ways. And these are usually painful feelings, usually feelings that are exceedingly uncomfortable and certainly not ones we want to think that we as decent human beings might even have. And yet it's important to recognize, if they come up, that these are feelings that have come from experiences that need to be worked with. Otherwise, they will skew our practice. They will skew our interactions with other human beings, perhaps even more than they might already do. And so it's absolutely vital, as part of this long maturation, which begins way before any kind of kensho, begins the moment you step foot into the zendo or sit down on the cushion, because it goes hand in hand with deepening Zen practice. At Hidden Valley Zen Center, where I also teach, there is a scroll, and it says, though the 8 winds may blow, it is not disturbed. It's easy to misunderstand that and think that no matter what happens, we're just going to be smooth and easy and unmoved around by it. Unmoved around by it does not mean denial of it, does not mean not feeling. Those 8 winds it's a metaphor for all the challenging negative feelings people can have: anger, various different discomforts of various different kinds, and so on and so forth. And we usually try to avoid feeling these things. They're not comfortable. And we're often taught as children that we shouldn't be feeling them as well. And yet the very people that are teaching us that we shouldn't have these feelings are ones that often have them themselves as well, and also have no clues as to how not to have them or how to work with them when they do come up. And this is why it is so important when we have challenging times in our practice, particularly if we have any sense that we have a history of trauma, that we work with a psychological expert, a therapist, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, somebody to help us understand these feelings. It is not about repressing them. It's about offering radical acceptance. Okay, this is how I feel. It really feels shitty. And then there's a chance, because we have owned them in essence, to be able to work with them effectively and positively. That is also a major part of our practice. It's not about shutting ourselves down and kind of zooming above the radar in a place of what really is dissociation or near dissociation, assuming that is good Zen practice. There are times when we will feel at ease. There are also plenty of times, at least in my experience, when we will feel anything but. And as an example in my own life, for many years, I went to many sesshin. I was living at the Rochester Zen Center and going to all the sesshin possible. And even when some of us moved out to Santa Fe to build what never got built in the end, it was supposed to be a semi-retirement temple center, place where senior people could train with Roshi Kapleau in his semi-retirement, while the Rochester Zen Center was taken care of initially by Tony Packer. All of that fell apart, but the intention was there. And still, during that period of time, we would, as a group, we had bought a van, and we would drive back to Rochester for sesshin quite frequently. And also, Kapleau-roshi came out to the New Mexico area and gave sesshin as well. So there were always many sesshin. And for a long time, sesshin was a hell realm for me. And not only that, but I was assigned a koan. I was assigned the mu koan, and I couldn't even remember what it was that I was supposed to be doing in the Zendo. That was how dissociated I was in the early years, and for good reason. Fortunately, when the terror began to come out of its hidden corners, I was able to work with some very helpful, very kind therapists. And it has taken many years, actually, to work through my history and all of the conditioning that came around it. And I'm still finding times and places where my behavior is not what I would like it to be. And I tune in and recognize the sources of it, which gives a golden opportunity to then work with letting go those places. But we cannot let them go without experiencing them. If you are riding above a history of pain and suffering that is buried rage, sadness, lack of self-esteem, and all the rest of that deep in your psyche, it doesn't work. You're not going to become more free. You're going to become more shut down, more likely. So this is an absolutely vital aspect of modern Zen practice in the West, that we open our arms and embrace the physical experience of any of the difficult emotions that come up. And again, as I said, we own them. We offer them radical acceptance. Well, I don't like how it feels, but this has come up. Let's explore the origins. Let's see what happened. Where did it come from? And when we become one with the energy of the moment, it has far less impact. And that's very different from going into denial of it and dissociating from the feeling because they're not comfortable. This is all part of Zen practice and a very vital part of Zen practice. I can't emphasize it enough. Toda-enji was, as far as I know, the most major proponent, if not the only one, of the long maturation. And he was a man who, as I said yesterday, started practicing when he was 8 years old. And by the time he was 21, he had already had his first Kensho and had a much deeper one, and then a much deeper one yet. And as you heard also, he strained and stressed himself to the extreme, which is not really something we would ordinarily call for in practice, although there are times to go beyond, times to push the envelope, because then we can break through into a new, deeper understanding. But to do it in extremity, it can get one into trouble. And it did for him. It got him what is probably assumed to be TB, tuberculosis. And he was dying. And because he was so deep in practice, he felt that perhaps there was something that he understood about Zen practice that might be of valuable to share with others. And so he did. He took to his bed and rested, slept, and when he felt like being upright and writing, he wrote. And the result, as you already know, is this wonderful book, Discourse on the Inexhaustible Lamp. And as you also know, he did recover, and he lived into his 70s and was teaching for many, many years as well, although he was somewhat reluctant teacher. It is important to not deny any painful emotions. It doesn't mean we're bad people. That is something important to recognize. It is simply an expression of the experiences we may have had as children that we became conditioned by. And by and large, most people who come to Zen practice come out of some level of a history of suffering. The Buddha did. He was so shocked by the three sights that he saw when he was in his late 20s, a corpse, a dead person, a sick person, and a very old person. Somehow he had never seen these things in all his 27, 28 years before. And they shocked him because he was told that he too was subject to these conditions. And it was enough to throw him into turmoil and make him choose to find some way out of the suffering. Most of us are not in the same degree of suffering, hopefully, but some of us are. And it's worth accepting, honoring, but not wallowing in. Here's the middle way. To recognize when there are difficult feelings, and difficult feelings come up in response to trying to function as a result of having been abused, for example, or had extremely negative experiences. Toni Packer once told me that there was only one person she had ever met. By that time, she was already teaching Zen, and she was also a psychologist. There was only one person she had ever met who had not come to Zen practice through suffering. And she added, it only took him 6 months to uncover it. If life is rosy, what's the point in practice? Why do it? If things are fine, well, I guess it might be more interesting to explore, but most people are not motivated so much to practice if they've had a wonderfully rosy life. There's been something else going on, some other incident. There was a man that came to visit Roshi Kapleau many, many years ago, about, by that time, I think it was about 10 years after the end of the Second World War, and he had been in the invasion of Normandy. And he was so struck by the intense suffering, by the horrors of such an event, that when he returned to the United States, he couldn't do anything but wander the streets of New York City, just lost in this question of, why is there so much suffering? Why? And after about 6 months, apparently, he was so deeply questioning that he'd actually bump into telephone poles walking down the street, that he actually had a kind of an awakening. It's not clear how deep it was, because by the time he came to see Roshi Kapleau, it was a memory. Kapleau-Roshi said, well, if you start doing Zazen, you'll probably be able to re-experience that freedom, that joy, that liberation. But he never saw the man again. We don't know what happened. Zazen is not so easy, as pretty much all of you know. And it's almost like we have to be pushed against the wall to be willing to do it. There is this lure of the joy of enlightenment. And I have to admit myself that for some time, I hung on to the enlightenment stories in the 3 Pillars of Zen. They gave me hope that somehow, out of my anguish, I could find some freedom. And I finally actually had to quit reading the 3 Pillars, because I was discovering that sesshin, as sesshin went along, I would start to get into some kind of mind state and think, oh boy, I'm almost there. And so it's like I was trying to sit with one eye on my practice and the other eye on the enlightenment stories, and that was not ever going to work. This is why faith is so important in practice. Over the centuries, the Chinese masters, the earlier Japanese masters as well, understood the necessity of what's called post-satori training and the long maturation to continue to deepen. It's tempting, and I know in my first sesshin ever, I got to know a woman for whom it was not her first sesshin. It was the first sesshin a year after she had had a Kensho experience, and she hadn't bothered to do practice from the Kensho until that sesshin, because it was just so cool, just so nice, so easy life. And thankfully, she came back to the practice. But I do know other people with whom I was actually training at the Rochester Zen Center. We were all living on campus, so to speak. It was called on staff back then, and who were practicing diligently, multiple daily sittings, many sesshin, and once they had Kensho, it's like somehow the motivation left to continue practicing. And it can do that for people. Some people come to Zen practice through a felt need to be a little bit more free, or from some level of suffering. And then when they have a Kensho experience, it relieves that tension to the degree that they don't feel like practicing anymore, which is kind of sad, because in my experience, there's no end to how deeply you can go and how increasingly free a person can become of their stuff and openly manifesting increasingly the innate compassion and wisdom that we are born with. Every human being is perfect, whole and complete. And unless we are severely abused, which basically is ignored, abandoned, unless we have severe abandonment in our history, ongoing severe abandonment in our history, we are able to benefit openly through the practice to manifest that innate compassion within us. It's rare that somebody has a situation where they're grown up where that doesn't happen, but it does happen. There's a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. It's a collection of stories by an eminent psychologist. And most of the stories are actually quite heartening. I mean, including the one about the boy who was raised as a dog. But there was one story in there because this psychologist was asked to comment on a case where a 13-year-old boy had actually murdered two 12-year-old girls in his apartment house. And there was a question about whether to try him as an adult or not. And this man was called in to give a psychological evaluation. And the history of this child is that he was the second child born to an immigrant family. And initially, when the first child was born, the family was surrounded by extended family. The father had a job in the area where relatives were. The mother was a little bit simple and easily stressed. And so whenever she was overwhelmed, there were plenty of aunts and uncles and cousins and so on to take this infant or this growing child in hand and give them the love and nurturing that for a temporary being she couldn't. And then the father got a job in a faraway place, and so they moved away from family and had a second child, and the mother couldn't cope. And so she would leave this infant in a crib in a dark room all day long while she took her then 3-year-old out to the park and played with him. And this infant in the dark crib got none of the nurturing, none of the feedback that is so essential for a child to develop normally. And he was the one that grew up, well, I don't know how old he grew up to, but when he was 13, he clearly was psychopathic because he simply had never gotten the feedback, the nurturing, the understanding of how to live and how to work with feelings that naturally take place as a child is nurtured, held, embraced, fed, and so on and so forth. Hopefully, none of us have experienced this level of suffering. But again, many of us come to Zen practice through some discomfort. And it can be historic or it can be modern, but it needs to be worked with until its effects have been mitigated, not denied, but work with how we learn to experience the difficult feelings. And this is why during the metta meditations, we don't talk about when we say free from anger, for example, we also usually add, it doesn't mean that anger doesn't come up, but that we have learned how to work with it. And working with it means tuning into the energy of that anger in our body. And if it's a prevalent issue, then to work with a therapist about what the sources of it were and how to uncouple those in a sense and come to peace with it. Anger is a normal human emotion, but at base it's energy. And when we recognize it as the energy that it is, then it can serve us well. The challenge is what rides behind it in terms of our ideas about it. And that is what needs to be worked with. So there are many, many times in practice, and I'm talking about this on day 2 because day 2 is often the day when stuff comes up for people during sesshin. It's important to recognize that you're not a bad person, even though it may feel like you're the most wretched human being in the universe. Even though you may recognize that there is behavior in your past that has been toxic, if you want to call it that, or has caused pain and suffering to other people. And again, that it comes up is important to work with, because then you can work with it. If we go into denial about our feelings, then there's no way to come to terms with them, to become free of the feelings right in the midst of when we were actually feeling them. And to become free with the feelings, free of the feelings when we're in the midst of them, it means that we're not compelled to act out on them. And this is why it's so important to come to terms with them. Historically, people have had feelings. Talk about Rinzai, a great master, Chinese master, through whose heirs, there's a long line of heirs from Rinzai. He was such a phenomenal human being, such a phenomenal teacher. And yet, in those days in China, when one went to a temple, there was not the formal setup of sanzen or doksan that we know in the West. Instead, monks gathered together in a monastery. Every once in a while, the master would give a talk, and the monks were free to ask questions, but basically that was the teaching. There was no personal teaching in general, unless a monk wanted to go and see the master personally. So Rinzai had been at the temple for 3 years and never asked a question. And the head monk saw that there was something special about this man and said, "Why don't you go ask the master a question? How come you haven't asked him before?" And Rinzai said, "Well, I don't know what to ask him." And so the head monk, gave him a question, and he went dutifully to the master and asked the question. And the master's response was a bit of a shock to Rinzai. He said, "I spare you 60 blows." What? And so that kind of flummoxed him. And the head monk afterwards said, "Well, what did he say?" I don't get it." He said he'd spare me 60 blows. Like he was intending to hit me because I had said something wrong, or what? And the monk said, "Well, why don't you go ask him again?" And again, the same thing happened. And again, Rinzai, what's wrong with me? Why am I failing in this endeavor? And a third time, the head monk said, "Well, maybe third time's a charm. Go ask him again." And again, the same thing happened. And Rinzai was so discouraged, feeling like he was just not good at practice, that he felt he needed to leave the temple. And the head monk went to the master and said, this guy's got something on the ball. Take care of him. Send him in the appropriate direction. And so when Rinzai went to say goodbye to the master as appropriate, the master said, go and see my Dharma brother, and he can help you. And so Rinzai did go. But all the time he went, he was like, what is wrong with me? How come, what about this question? What? And of course, in those days, people walked wherever they went. And the monasteries were in remote areas and tops of mountains. And so it was a while before he got to the other teacher. And I think you all know that when he did go, the other teacher said, where'd you come from and why? And Rinzai explained, and the new master said, well, you idiot. Here he was like an old grandmother feeding you, and you didn't get it. And at that point, Rinzai was awakened. And anyway, the rest is history. And there was Kyogen too. Something similar happened to him. And he was so in despair. This time, he wasn't sent to another monastery. He decided he was so bad at practice, at least what he could do was to take care of the grave of an old master. And the grave had fallen into disrepair. And so he went, and he lived in this tumble down place for some years. And at one point, he was sweeping around the grave, and a piece of broken tile hit a bamboo, tuck, and it triggered an awakening for him. These awakenings didn't come out of nowhere. They came because of the deep questioning that these men had as they were in despair. They weren't as much caught in the despair as they were with what is it? Why? And so they did come to awakening. There are many other stories too. The important thing is that awakening is a beginning. Kala Rinpoche, who used to come to Santa Fe when he was still alive, and those of us who had stayed of the group that came out from the Rochester Zen Center, I used to go and hear his talk. And it was always interesting. Somehow the Tibetan Buddhists have a way of putting things into words that are easy to understand, concepts that are easy to understand. And it was the same for him. There's a book of his teachings titled A Flash of Lightning in the Dark Night. And in it, he talks about how awakening is exactly like that, a flash of lightning in a dark night, that you're hiking up this mountain path, and it's pitch black dark, there's no moon, and you're stumbling along, finding your way, groping and tripping over rocks and so on and so forth, and you're persisting. And at a certain point, there's a flash of lightning, and suddenly the path in front of you is illuminated briefly. Now you know where you can go. Now you know the path. And it's the same with Kensho in Zen. It is an opening. It is a beginning, because now we can see more clearly where we need to work. And not only that, but that clarity also is accompanied by an openness to and an ease to dealing more with our stuff. And somehow it is a little bit easier to recognize when we are being unskillful, and to choose by owning that in our bodies, by feeling the remorse, feeling the energy of, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that way. And then the next time the habit pattern would come up, because these are in our brain, right? The synapses are the neurons are connected through the synapses, and every time we continue to do the behavior, it reinforces the connection. So when we have a Kensho experience, and after that we begin to see more clearly our behavior, it's just the tip of the iceberg, by the way, but still it's the tip of the iceberg. Then it's almost like before we would automatically indulge in those habit patterns, that warning sign comes up. You really want to do it again? And it's so much easier to stop. And each time we don't indulge in a negative habit pattern, it weakens those neuron connections. And eventually, they just don't connect anymore. This is one of the wonderful things about brain plasticity, that until the moment we die, we can still change, we can still open, we can still become more free if we put our minds to it and if we're willing to do the work. So the bottom line here is that as we do practice, stuff comes up, feelings come up, and they may not be comfortable feelings. And by the way, if bliss comes up, that's a little bit of a warning sign that you want to back out of that. That's makyo usually. But when things come up, it's so vital not to override them, but to learn how to work with them. And this wonderful book, Focusing, by Eugene Gendlin, Gendlin, is of great help. It was certainly of great help to me in this process. In fact, it's so helpful in terms of working with difficult feelings that we give a copy to each of the women veterans that comes to our Regaining Balance retreats for women veterans with PTSD, because it can be so effective in helping deal with difficult and painful emotions. So don't, whatever you do, don't override them, don't stuff them, don't deny them, and also don't wallow in them. But take to heart that here's a wonderful opportunity to become free, more free, and then do the work. If it means seeing a psychologist or a therapist, so much the better. A lot of times, these professionals can help us get places faster than we can on our own. In fact, it's well known among therapists that I know that people who do Zen practice and also do therapy progress so much faster in their therapy. And I would say, as a Zen teacher, that they also progress much faster in their practice as a result of doing that therapy. It kind of clears obstacles. It's a long haul. So have faith, keep that determination going, and keep working. It's worth it, and you can do it. So thank you for listening. I'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.